And we are going to give the time to Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna, 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to welcome the officials for joining us today. I'm just going to dive right in. How many international students are in our country right now on a valid student visa? Madame May?
Those figures with me, although perhaps my colleague Julie can see if we have them with us here. Based on the latest processing stats that I've seen, though, we have 200,000
Overall,
fewer
yeah, I'm just asking for the overall number. Can that be tabled to our committee?
Absolutely.
Sorry, can that be tabled, please, if that's okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Do we know what the number of approvals were last year for student visas?
We can also table those figures with the committee.
Do we know how many came through the student direct stream versus the regular channel?
Happy to provide that data to the committee.
Do you know what the average processing time was for the student direct stream?
I can provide that data separately to the committee.
Do you know how much time it took to process the security component of those SDS programs for those applicants?
I don't have that information with me, but we can provide that information to the committee.
Mr. Chair, can I ask to have these numbers tabled to us within the next 14 calendar days if possible? I think it's important for the committee to know the landscape of what we're operating in right now.
But are they comfortable with it? Ms. May, you want to respond?
The department would be happy to follow up with the data that's requested.
Sorry.
The department would be pleased to provide the committee with the data requested. I think we'll have to just revert on timelines, but we're happy to provide it in a timely manner.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And the reason why I'm asking this is that we've seen an increase of numbers of students coming to our country. I think the minister has already admitted that himself. And with the SDS program being a fast-tracked way of applicants coming to our country, we are prioritizing speed to get through to accept as many students as possible. And we have a concern because if you recall last year in 2023, we let in a student into our country who was later found charged and arrested for potentially carrying out one of the largest terrorist attacks in our Jewish community, who turned out to be an ISIS supporter and terrorist. So this information is very important for us to make sure that we're not compromising speed for the security of our country. So if I could get those documents as soon as possible, and if, again, I ask in the next 14 days, that'll be helpful for us to make those, to have a discussion on this in a very meaningful manner. I'm just going to switch over to our officials from the IRB, just to have an idea from you as well. The minister recently said that there has been a massive increase or alarming trend, is his exact words, of international students that are claiming asylum in our country. How many international students claimed asylum last year?
We don't actually track information that way at the IRB. You'd have to ask IRCC. So the way the asylum process works is we get referrals of claimants from IRCC and CBSA. So they would have a list of who claimed from that stream.
Madame May, is that something else you could provide to us when you are providing other documents?
I believe the department could provide more information on that to the committee.
Okay. A follow-up. Have you seen an increase in workload for your department since the recent November 1st changes to the international students program that was made by the minister? Have you seen a workload increase? Have you seen an increase in referrals to your department?
We've consistently we're on track this year to have over 200,000 referrals. So from April 1st to March 31st, we have a fiscal year, it's about 200,000. So it's been consistently high throughout the year. In terms of referrals, there's eligibility processing that happens in the front end before a claim is referred to us. So anecdotally, I don't have a marked increase. We just have had a significant volume for the past year.
And is that a normal, significant volume that you've seen in previous years, or just this year you've seen that spike?
In the past couple of years, we've seen a significant increase. And during the pandemic, with the border closure, we saw a decrease. But
would you agree with the Minister of Immigration when he said that there has been an increase in fraud and abuse and fake claims in the asylum program? Have you seen that in your department?
We look at every claim as a claim. So in terms of how we look at integrity issues, There are a couple of safeguards in the system, so the minister can intervene on a claim if they feel that there's an integrity issue. We have the power to send red letters, which signifies there might be an integrity risk on a file as well. But, as an independent tribunal, we look at every file individually on its merits.
What is the average lead time for a case be processed at the RPD from being referred to you and finding a decision?
Currently, it's 14 months. We're funded for about 60,000 finalizations this year, but with the intake right now at over 200,000 claims, the wait time for a claim that's coming in now will be about 44 months.
44 months? Wow, that's a big number. And do you expect it to keep on growing as well?
If intake keeps growing, so about 70% of our inventory is about a year old, less than a year.
And what does it last this high? Is this a first time you're seeing this in our country?
The highest volume that the IRB has had.
And I'm just going to shift back to our other officials. Minister,
Thank you very much, Mr. Khanna. And we tried 604 and Madam Zaid is going to go. So let me set it up, this one here. Just a minute. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to the officials for coming today. My first question is for the IRCC. In your communications with the provinces and the territories, have they addressed any plans they have to house the international students being admitted by the designated learning institutions they are responsible for regulating within their own provinces, and to ensure they are not exploited by the unscrupulous employers that pay them under the table or provide unsafe working conditions?
So the causes of the housing supply gap in Canada are many, and international students are among the cohort that's most affected by inadequate housing or lack of access to housing. As part of the way that the cap was designed, the federal government is providing an allocation to provinces and territories, a number of spaces that they can then distribute to learning institutions. And one of the factors that provinces can consider in doing that is looking at community conditions, availability of housing, also the degree to which institutions can provide housing to students in making the decision about which schools should receive a certain number of spaces. So there is latitude for the provinces to be considering that and to making thoughtful decisions about how to distribute the spaces that are available under the cap.
How about in your communications with the educational institutions? Have the educational institutions and specifically the private colleges recognize the need to ensure that there is adequate, safe, and suitable housing for the level of students they are asking to admit? And have they outlined plans to ensure that housing will be available for everyone they admit in their institutions?
I think it's incumbent on institutions to be recruiting at a level that matches both their ability to provide housing, as well as considering within the community what the availability of housing is. And so I do think it's incumbent on institutions to be moderating their recruitment based on those factors.
Like there are a lot of issues we have heard. So are you asking the provinces to ask these questions from the educational institutions, or because at the end of the day, provinces are responsible for that, or are you having any communications with those educational institutions to ask for that?
Absolutely. We're in continuous dialogue with provinces and territories. Not a day goes by that my team and I are not in touch with our provincial and territorial counterparts. We host a table every week where we spend an hour working through issues, problem solving, meeting bilaterally. And one of the issues that is discussed in that forum is housing and many other issues related to student vulnerability and the effective administration of the program. We have similar conversations with national education associations. We have direct communication with the learning institutions. And again, these themes also emerge in our conversations in those meetings.
Specifically with regards to the province of Ontario, which has seen a substantial increase in international student admissions, particularly at private colleges, has the province shared any plans it has to address these substantial increases and fulfill its jurisdictional requirement to ensure these are all legitimate institutions providing a quality education and a safe learning environment to students they are charging very high fees to?
In the case of the province of Ontario, they are part of the multilateral table that we convene. We work with the Education Ministry and Immigration Ministries in Ontario. We have bilateral conversations on a regular basis with Ontario. I would say those conversations are constructive. There's not always agreement on the way forward or on all aspects or on every day, but it is a productive conversation that we are having at official level.
Further, in regards to that, Minister Miller noted that he gave them ample notice, as reported in the National Post and Toronto Star, to the provinces and the territorial counterparts. And it was reported in the National Post and Toronto Star, and that any suggestion otherwise is, quote, complete garbage, end quote. The minister said, quote, we said quite clearly they need to get their house in order. We spoke specifically about Ontario, that has the largest number of international students, end quote. And in addition to this, the federal government invited provincial counterparts to meetings that they never showed up to. Minister Miller further noted in respect to provinces and territories getting their houses in order that, quote, if that job can't be done, the federal government is prepared to do it, end quote.
Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, at the federal level, we've taken decisive action. A multi-layered set of reforms have been put in place. But we can't act alone, right? It requires the collaboration with all levels of government and other stakeholders, learning institutions, everybody that has an interest in and responsibility with respect to the post-secondary sector. So,
thank you. Thank you, Chair.
To the honorable members and the witnesses, this study is to do with the international students that are seeking asylum. And when the department or the IRB responds, and when you are going to give those statistics and numbers, they should be focused on that particular, because our study is going to, otherwise we have to come back to you to figure it out. If you can amalgamate all the asylum seekers in one file, we would not be able to know the students. That's where it is. And now we're going to go to Mr. Brunel Sepp. Please go ahead for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In September, Mr. Miller announced that he was going to cap the number of international students coming to Canada. And do you have targets per province? Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a matter of fact, we don't have any targets yet. We are working on the provincial caps, and right now we only have come to cap the pan-Canadian numbers. So just to be clear, when you say that you're going to reduce the numbers based on discussions and conversations and collaborations with the provinces, how can you say that and not plan that you would necessarily have to choose which are the provinces that would be the most affected by this reduction in the number of students? Thank you for your question. Mr. Chair, I'd like to say that we have not yet set caps per province, but we are currently discussing and analyzing in order to determine and finalize these. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, with the numbers that you have, I'm sure you probably have an idea currently of which provinces will see much more significant reduction in the student permits issued in their territory compared to other provinces. I'm sure you probably know by now. Well, thank you very much. Like was the case last year, we have a methodology we use to distribute the national caps between provinces and territories. We take into consideration numerous factors such as the approval rate, as well as the demographic situation of each province and territory. Hence, the reason why Minister Miller mentioned that we would proceed with the same methodology this year. We are simply finalizing it, and I can't provide further comment than this. So logically, Quebec, if we look at the demographics, we look at a number of student permits issued, Quebec should not be affected at the same level as Ontario. There should not be a significant reduction in Quebec. I'm sure you cannot address that question, right? Well, no problem. Minister Miller stopped access to certain programs for students coming out of those programs in order to obtain a post-graduation work permit. And there was the Federation of Cegeps that raised a red flag, mentioning that this could pose problems to us, especially in regions in Quebec, where you've got college programs where international students enroll and study, college programs in different regions in Quebec that are directly targeting the socioeconomic needs of the region. In Saint-Félicien, for instance, the CEGEP will offer a course on timber processing, which is an important sector in Quebec, especially in Lac Saint-Jean. Now, making it such that these students can no longer be issued post-graduation work permits, I fail to understand the relevance of such a measure when this does not necessarily change anything on the cap of on the number of students admitted. Because once they're admitted, why then would you not want to issue them the post-graduation work permit? Thank you for your question. I'll address your question in two steps. The first one, the reforms to the post-graduation work permit were based on two key principles. The first is about managing the volumes and numbers. As you know, the measures that we put in place in order to cap the student permits as well as post-graduation work permits, which are issued upon graduation, this helps government to meet its commitment of 5%, which is so that the number of temporary residents remains at 5% by 2026. That is one of the considerations which we had in mind during this while taking this decision. The second one is better recalibrating this program with our labor shortage demands on a national scale, as well as access to permanent residency streams. So the reforms that we undertook on the post-graduation work permit were based on the labor needs at national level. Well, by so doing, are we not directly, if you'll allow me, we're simply plugging this on what's happening. So I see people who have a bachelor's degree, who have a master's degree, who have a doctorate degree, will have access to a post-graduation work permit. Are we saying that the different positions where we require, where there's a significant labor shortage, requires necessarily a bachelor's degree or a master's degree? Thank you. College education, as in CEGEPs in Quebec, have a really important role to play. So, I mean, nobody is contradicting that. Nobody's, the issue is not being questioned here. Well, forgive me, because in your before that, you just mentioned that these exemptions were a thought of based on the labor shortages at national level. But right now, you're telling me that I'm right in the sense that you're saying that college programs train people in the trades where we have a significant labor shortage. I think there's a bit of a contradiction here.
Ms. Paz, very briefly. I want to give brief chance to Ms. Pars to respond, if you want to.
Donc, je vous dirais que,
Well, what I'll say is,
commencer à dire, l'éducation
like I
collégiale, c'est
started
important
responding,
pour que les
college
jeunes
education
succèdent.
is really important
Il
in
y a eu une
addressing labor
augmentation, un
shortages.
accroissement
Having said this, there's been a
incroyable
significant
de niveau
spike
du
in
nombre d'étudiants
the
étrangers
number of
qui
foreign or
intègrent les
international
collèges,
students
cégeps. Et
going
donc,
attending these
avec
colleges and
l'objectif
CEGEPs,
primaire donc, de
and
proximité
with
et
the
de
primary
calibrer les
objective of
volumes, il
recalibrating
se fallait de
the
prendre
numbers, we had
une
to
mesure qui
take
peut-être qui peut
take a
sembler
measure,
drastique, mais qui est
which may
nécessaire.
sound drastic, but is all the
Thank
same
you. No more,
necessary.
Ms. Bruce. Before we continue the recent reforms to international student program, there is a point of order.
Yes.
Mr. Al-Khoury.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make it clear, I believe there is some misunderstanding here. Our study must be focused on the recent reform of the program and not on the asylum claims. Can you illustrate that to the committee, please? Thank you.
Thank you, honorable member. The clear purpose of the study here is the recent reforms to the international student program, but every member has a right to ask questions on whichever topic they want to, and I cannot stop them as long as it is out of order. But it is up to the officials. This is why I wanted to make it very clear that this study is only focusing on the student, and particularly I agree with you that this study is focused on the recent reforms to international student program. With that in mind, I'm going to stop the watch, reset it, and can I go to MP Kwan for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for their appearance here today. My first question is to the IRCC officials. With respect to the fraudulent letters numbers that you have just shared with us, do you have any indication of any particular individuals, organizations that are issuing these fraudulent letters? Is there any pattern or trend that's emerging?
The enhanced letter of acceptance system has been in place now for about 10 months, and so we're in the process of analyzing the data associated with the 10,000 plus letters of acceptance, something we will be paying very close attention to and taking a very close look at.
All right. I think it's important to have that analysis, and once that analysis is complete, will you share that information with committee? And when do you expect the analysis? The first round of analysis would be completed?
I'll need to revert to the committee at a later point just to confirm when it would be possible to share that information.
All right. With respect to that analysis, will the department, aside from looking at patterns of violators, potential groups and organizations that are taking advantage of students with these fraudulent letters on their letters of acceptance, will you be including in that analysis what type of institutions are being utilized for these fraudulent letters, i.e., would it be private institutions versus public institutions, colleges versus universities, and so on? Will that be part of the analysis?
It's not always the case that a letter would originate from an institution, so but we would need to look at various possible sources.
Yeah. Maybe I can reframe, because obviously these are fraudulent letters of acceptance. It wouldn't be issued from the institution themselves. But however, the list of institutions that are being used for the purpose of these fraudulent letters, I would be interested in obtaining information to determine, are they, what percentage, what is the number, are private institutions? And then what's the percentage are public institutions? How many of them are colleges? How many of them are universities, and so on? Because that will tell you a very specific set of information that I think is important with respect to trying to tackle fraudulent activities.
Completely agreed. That's a very important line of analysis.
All right. And so I would make this further request to make sure that the committee is share this information. And I would argue that this is not information that should be kept secret. It should be public and transparent and to be shared with all Canadians so that we're aware of what is the landscape of how international students are being taken advantage of. With respect to that analysis, will there be information and data analysis on what countries are being targeted?
We can look into that for sure. You're speaking about, I would assume, the country of origin of the applicant to which the letter was issued. Yes, that can be looked at as well.
All right, thank you. Yes, correct. I mean, that will also tell us a lot, right? Where the student bodies are being taken advantage of and being fraudulently or faced with fraudulent activities. All right, and so I guess that is all to say with respect to this analysis, I think is critical. I think actually having collected this much information, you are able to do your preliminary analysis and for that to be done as soon as possible and for that information to be shared with committee. I think it would be critical for the purpose of this study for us to receive that information before we actually write the final report. So, so I will just leave that there, and I hope that we can get that information. Now, on the flip side of that, Mr. Chair, I'll be interested in knowing how many of the applications that's come through your screening process at this point indicate a valid letters of acceptance.
I believe we've had about 500,000 applications that have been run through the system. About 93% of those were positive matches. When I say that, it's the application comes in with the letter of acceptance. IRCC pings the institution associated with that letter of acceptance, and then they confirm the authenticity of the letter. So in 93% of the cases, there was a match confirmed by the institution. 2% were not matched. 1% were indicated as canceled by the DLI. And we have about 2.7% from which we received no response from the DLI.
Sorry, what was no response?
2.7% no response from the DLI.
Okay. And so likewise, I assume that this analysis is also being done with respect to the data points that we mentioned earlier. If you can confirm that, and if you can also share that information with the committee when it's available.
Okay, happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. I want to move on to talking about the discussion or consultation or conversations that the ministry had with institutions. There was some indication that there was discussion with institutions, so I'm particularly interested in public education institutions, colleges and universities. I wonder if you can share with committee what was their comments with the government's plan to changes, and where the areas to which they flag are deep concern.
We've had intensive discussions with national education associations, learning institutions, provinces and territories over the course of the last 18 months. And that's, through the tables that we convene and through ongoing conversations around all of the measures that were highlighted in my opening remarks. And over the summer in particular, we provided detailed forward plans for a number of additional changes that would be made and announced and were subsequently announced in the fall. And all provinces, territories, education associations were able to provide comments to us. In addition, we're in the late stages of a regulatory amendment process where those regulatory changes were actually posted for public comment as well. So there's been extensive consultation. In terms of wanting to know the specific comments that were provided in case of the regulatory package, those are available publicly. And I do think that the stakeholders themselves are probably better able to convey their views of the reforms.
Thank you very much. It's 7 minutes, 13 seconds, so long over the time. So now I'm going to go 5 minutes Conservatives, 5 minutes Liberal, 2.5 Bloc, 2.5 NDP, and then we will release the witnesses. So 15 minutes more, please. I hope you understand. Are you okay with that, witness? Good. Thank you. With that in mind, we can go to Mr. Kimmich for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So very quickly to the IRCC official specifically on housing, because you mentioned it in your opener. It's mentioned 36 times in the immigration levels plan. Is your branch the one that wrote the warning that was talked about in the Canadian press, that internal reports warned Minister Fraser when he was immigration minister that the high levels of immigration levels to Canada were going to cause a housing crunch?
As I mentioned earlier, the housing supply gap has many factors, and it would be unfair to say that it is caused by international students.
No, sorry, Chair.
In
No,
terms of your
sorry. That's
specific
not what I'm saying. I'm asking about. I did
Honourable
raise my
member, go
hand,
ahead,
Chair.
please.
I asked specifically about an internal report that journalists have spoken about and written about in the Canadian press, the National Post, and other media outlets from January 2024, referring to material written in 2022, so 2 years ago, saying that there was going to be a housing crunch and making the connections directly to the immigration levels to Canada. That's not me saying it. That's an internal IRCC report. So I'm asking, is your branch or either of you two the ones that wrote this report?
I joined the department about 18 months ago. I can't speak to anything prior to that. What I can say is over the last 18 months, we have been having continuous conversations. Information has been sought and received by the minister about challenges in the international student program, and that is what has led to the reforms that I summarized.
So I'm going to interrupt you there. So I want that internal report because journalists have access to it, and I would like it tabled with this committee in an unredacted format, because that is directly what's led to changes in international student program. Everybody has made that connection. I think all members, especially on the opposition side, are deserving to know what the minister was warned about before he was shuffled out of his portfolio because he had failed and a new minister was put in. So can you make that commitment to file that with this committee? Journalists already have it. This committee doesn't have it.
I don't believe I have that report, so I would need to revert to the department and return to the committee with a response.
Can we
with
consider that a
respect to your
commitment to
question.
provide us with the report?
Ms. May, you want to respond?
Oh, I had responded.
Okay, Chair. I'm going to move on but on housing. Housing starts are now down an extra 15% from last year. When the department was preparing the immigration levels plan, how much did they look at international students specifically as a source of reductions for the total numbers in order to avoid the pressures that the department warned the ministers 2 years ago on? What percentage did you consider on it were related to the housing crunch, related to international study program?
So I'm here today in my capacity as the Director General for the International Students Program. The Levels Plan is led out of another area of the department, so they would be able to provide you more details on what pieces of information.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I would agree with you, but this levels plan has temporary resident numbers now. So it includes your sides as well. And that's the first time it's in there. So it includes your branch of your department is now included in the levels plan. That's why I'm asking what total percentage was considered and directly related to housing.
So as you've just mentioned, this levels plan is the first time that temporary resident volumes have been reflected. And international students do make up the largest share of the temporary resident volume. In January of this year, a decision was made on international students to set the level at based on a zero net growth model. So what that meant was that the amount of new study permits that would be approved could not exceed the number of permits that were expiring in this year. And as a result of the government's commitment to reduce temporary resident volumes to 5% of the total population, a decision was taken that for 2025, that cap for students would need to be reduced by a further 10%, and for that number to be held constant in 2026.
And we'll go to Mr. Radikov for 2 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Chair, I'd like to move the following motion. It was distributed to members on Tuesday. That given that the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship has failed to appear before this committee on 8 separate invitations dating back to February 2024, including on the following matters: Supplementary Estimate C, the Mandatory Provident Fund, criminal cartels exploiting visa-free travel, Supplementary Estimates A, and the main estimates for fiscal year 24-25, the 2023 Annual Report to Parliament on Immigration, the Labour Market Impact Assessment Study, the Auditor General's 9th report on processing applications for permanent residence, and the impact of the recent changes to International Students Program study, the study that we're doing here today. The committee reports its disappointment to the House in the Minister's repeated failure to appear and summons the Deputy Minister and Associate Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship to testify before the committee for no less than 2 hours on November 18th to account for the Minister's absences and provide testimony on matters relevant to their department's mandates. You all have this motion. The Minister's consistent absence underscores a worrying lack of accountability during a period of escalating challenges and pressures on Canada's immigration system. The recent election on Tuesday in the United States could provide further pressure on Canada's immigration system and national security. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Minister tabled the 2024 Annual Report to Parliament on Immigration, ironically a whole year after failing to come to this committee to address the previous 2023 Annual Report. Yes, he does plan to appear on this issue, but it's really concerning because how can we trust this year's report when we weren't able to question him on last year's report? Our concerns as Conservatives over criminal elements potentially exploiting the current immigration system have never left us, and in fact, we have seen through the recent arrival of ISIS terrorists have only been heightened. The failure of the Minister to discuss criminal cartels exploiting visa-free travel is troubling, if not suspicious. Recent reports indicate that organized crime networks have exploited Canada's visa-free policies, facilitating human trafficking and other criminal activities. These security concerns necessitate stringent vetting and resource allocation. However, the lack of attention to the main estimates, along with the supplementary estimates, documents that outline the necessary funding for handling this increased immigration pressures, suggest that the Liberal government is unprepared to protect Canadians from these threats. Without appropriate resources, Canada's screening process could become overwhelmed, compromising national security. And the absence of the Minister to address these estimates calls into question the Liberal government's commitment to transparency and accountability. These are necessary. And finally, regarding today's study, international students contribute significantly to Canada's economy, but they need housing, infrastructure, and support services to thrive. To date, the Liberals have demonstrated they have no plan and no way of fixing this issue, and yet the Minister has so far refused to appear to speak to this important issue. My motion to summon the Deputy Minister and Associate Deputy Minister of IRCC reflects a crucial effort to uphold transparency and accountability in light of the Minister's ongoing absences. Canadians deserve a government that is responsive to emerging challenges and dedicated to safeguarding national security. It's time for Mark Miller to come to this committee to provide answers. It's time to bring it home. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chang. But please make, because I just want to mention it. I mean, it's totally in order, but I know that Bloc and NDP and Liberals had 5 minutes to 2.5. So basically, if we can keep the discussion short here and go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the member across for the motion, and I would suggest that we go to a vote on this motion.
None voting. All in favor? Against? I think the against have it. So against, right? You want to vote? Right? Record division. Okay, so we'll record the vote. Mr. Clark will take the vote. Please go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Ali. The question is on the motion of moved by Mr. Riddicup. Mr. Ali.
Against.
Mr. Chang.
I vote no.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Contre.
Ms. Yip.
No.
Ms. Zaid.
Against.
Mr. Kimmich. For. Mr. McGuire.
For.
Mr. McLean.
For.
Mr. Riddicup.
For.
Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe. Ms. Kwan.
Abstain.
So the motion is defeated, and we'll go to Liberals for 5 minutes on the recent reforms to International Students Program. Liberals, we are going to go with Mr. Ali. Mr. Ali, go ahead for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. as we're doing study on the reform, international student reform. My question is to IRCC officials. As international students have been exploited by post-secondary institutions, some post-secondary institutions, particularly in province of Ontario, what specific steps the federal government taking to hold these provinces accountable for lacks of accreditation standards and adequate support for international students?
Ms. May?
The way that the international student cap is structured, provinces, it's incumbent on provinces to consider a number of factors in terms of how they allocate spaces. And as a result, provinces and territories can make determinations and allocate spaces to institutions that are really meeting the highest standards in terms of hosting students. And it would be incumbent on provinces and territories to not allocate spaces to institutions that are simply not meeting those standards. So that is one aspect of it. Federally, we're also in the late stages of regulatory changes that will provide IRCC with additional tools to deal with non-compliant learning institutions. That will give IRCC some new tools, and also for us to work in concert with provinces to deal with institutions that are simply not playing by the rules and not supporting students properly.
Thank you. There also have been numerous cases of fly-by-night colleges and substandard institutions taking advantage of international students. Can you explain the federal government's approach in addressing these concerns, especially since some provinces have failed to implement effective oversight and regulations?
Improving the integrity of the student program and reducing vulnerability of students, it will take action from various levels of government. As I summarized in my opening remarks, there's a number of reforms that we've put in place to reinforce the program. As I've already said about the cap, when you address these issues, you're going to create a system that's kind of better aligned with the interests of Canadians and international students and the education sector in the long run. We're going to create fewer opportunities for exploitation. You're incentivizing stronger supports for students. And then also, when you're better calibrating the volume of international students to the amount of space that we have in our permanent resident programs, you're creating more meaningful opportunities for those that wish to stay. So there's kind of a multi-level approach that's multi-pronged approach at the federal level, and we're also working with partners to do everything that they can within their responsibilities, within their authorities, to make this a stronger program.
Thank you. Can you also talk about the public-private partnership, colleges, and the role that they have played, and how the federal government has stepped up to ensure integrity in the system?
Absolutely. So in December, Minister Miller announced that changes would be made to the post-graduation work permit program, specifically to close a loophole that was causing some unsustainable growth, particularly in certain areas of the country. These were situations where private colleges were delivering the curriculum of public institutions. And as a result of that, students were gaining access to work permits that otherwise were only intended for public institutions. And as a result of the action of closing that particular loophole, that access is no longer available. And that's kind of a very concrete action to address that particular integrity and volume issue.
Thanks. As the province is increasingly relying on international students as a major source of revenue, how does the federal government plan to ensure that financial incentives do not overshadow the need to provide adequate support for students, particularly in areas like housing and mental health services?
Brief answer, please. Time is almost up.
Thank you for the question. There are longstanding underlying funding issues in the post-secondary sector that must be acknowledged, but the reality is that international student tuition and volume cannot continue to compensate for those issues. In 2023, we saw, in that year alone, we saw an increase of about 30% in international student volumes, and that just simply cannot continue.
Thank you. And we will go to Mr. Bruno Decep, 2.5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame Spat, vous avez
Thank
dit
you, Mr.
tantôt,
Chair.
pardon si j'ai mal prononcé.
Ma'am,
Vous avez dit
sorry
tantôt
for
que
mispronouncing your
l'objectif,
name.
un des
You
objectifs
mentioned
principaux
earlier that the
des
objective, one
mesures
of
sur
the main
lesquelles
objectives
qui s'attardaient
of
au
the
collège, au
caps
cégep,
on
c'était parce
the
qu'il y avait eu un
post-graduation
volume,
work
une
permits was due
croissance
to the fact that
incroyable.
there
Le
was a
collègue vient de nous
significant
dire que la
rise.
croissance
Your colleague
carrément
just
non
mentioned that there
soutenable.
was an
Est-ce que vous
unsustainable
pouvez me
increase.
dire combien
Can you
d'étudiants
tell me how
internationaux
many
sont
international
présentement
students
dans le
are
réseau des cégeps
currently
au Québec?
in the CEGEPs in Quebec, CEGEP networks?
Ben, moi,
Right
je
now?
l'ai, Madame Spat.
I
C'est
don't
9
have
000.
those numbers right now. I have
C'est
them
9 000
right now,
étudiants
ma'am. It is
internationaux dans le réseau des
9,000
cégeps
international
au Québec.
students in the
Est-ce que vous
CEGEP
êtes en train de me dire
networks in Quebec. Are
que
you
9
telling
000
me
permis
that
d'études dans
9,000
l'ensemble des
student work
permis d'études
permits
canadiens
across all the
connaissent
other
une
student
croissance
permits issued
incroyable
in
et non
Canada, that this is a
soutenable?
significant and unsustainable increase? As you very well,
Nous, on prend un point de vue
we adopt a point of pan-Canadian or a federal approach in our reforms. Thank you. That's the response I wanted, Mr. Chair. What I've just heard is that there's a pan-Canadian measure in place in order to address an exponential growth in Ontario colleges, and that by so doing, they do not realize that Quebec has a different educational system from the rest of Canada. The network of CEGEPs in Canada is only 9,000 international students, and with the coast-to-coast post-graduation work permits, this is harmful for Quebec because for us, 10 technicians graduating out of the Saint-Félicien graduation training center on timber processing is very important for the region, and that is how our plants are able to function. And I've just heard now, word for word, that we do not know exactly how many of them were in the CEGEP network. Mr. Chair, on the part of the department, this is so disappointed, Mr. Chair, so disappointing. I am aware of this. How comes I'm aware and the department is not aware that only 9,000 international students in the CEGEP networks across Quebec are there? And I hear that these pan-Canadian measures and that nobody gives a damn about the situation of CEGEPs in Quebec. And I'm completely disappointed in this, and you'll allow me to stop my questions here. Thank you.
So the time is almost there, 20 seconds. So you want to answer, Mr. Bruno? You want them to respond? No? Okay, thank you. So we will go to MP Kwan for 2.5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My question actually follows. The reason why I asked about the consultation process is not that I don't know what they said, because I've been meeting with them directly. The question is whether or not the government knows what they're saying. That's what I'm trying to glean at. So to that point, I wonder if you can spend just a little bit of time telling us what is the government's response to the concerns that have been raised, particularly by public colleges and universities. And then second to that, I would also ask for the officials to table the response from the government to the public colleges and institutions.
If I may ask, which concern in particular would you like me to address?
Actually, all of them.
Would you like me to start in one place or in particular?
Well, how many have you heard, and what are they? Maybe you can summarize them. And then tell the committee what is your response, what is the government's response, and then to table the rest that you've not been able to cover. More to that, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, because I'm going to run out of time. I would also ask for the officials to table the documentations on the analysis that the government has done on the implications of the changes to the levels plan and the decisions related to international students. What analysis have they done with respect to those changes, the implications for institutions, for Canada's economy, broken down by provinces and territories? territories. And then communities as well. As we've already just heard from MP Bruno Duceppe, there are implications for Quebec that's different from British Columbia to Ontario. And even with my own province, there are differences with Vancouver versus Cowichan versus Ladysmith or any other smaller communities. What analysis has the government done, and will you table that information for the committee?
What I'd say is that, broadly speaking, there is consensus among stakeholders and other levels of government that there is a need for greater volume controls. There is broad understanding and concern over program integrity issues and the vulnerability of students. I would say all partners in this equation are acknowledging those issues. Where there's sometimes disagreement is about the pace of change. The pace of change has been quite rapid. It's been necessary, important work to do, but it will take, it's been a disruptive year and it will take a period of adaptation.
You have 10 seconds. Okay. Obviously, I'm not getting the real answers, but just some talking points. What I would really like is for the officials to table to the committee the detailed breakdown of the concerns that have been heard by categories of institutions, public colleges, private colleges, public universities, private universities, the different kinds of stakeholders that you have received, and the government's response to those respective concerns that have been raised, and then the analysis that has been done, Mr. Chair. Can I get a confirmation that we can get that information before the committee finalizes this, the writing of this report?
Thank you. It's 3 minutes and 15 seconds. I would love to ask Ms. May, you want to respond?
We'll take back the request to the department and get back to the committee.
Thank you very much. With that, I want to thank the witnesses on behalf of the committee, and we're going to suspend for 5 minutes before we set up the next 5 minutes. Mr. Comich for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. My first questions will be to Dr. Gatfield. I have a quote here from Universities Canada CEO. He says, Canada's international reputation has taken a huge hit. Would you agree with your colleague at Universities Canada?
The headlines around the world emphasize and raise concern about Canada having changed its historic welcoming of the best and brightest. And then from our perspective, that's a concern that we certainly share.
Okay. In order to, convince Canadians that the research universities are doing their part, I'm going to ask you a few very specific questions about the institutions that make up your organization. How much camping housing do they provide in total?
In recruiting international students at the graduate level in particular, but also at the undergraduate level, it is essential to think about it in terms of a systematic approach. It's not just getting an admission, but what are the supports? What is the question of housing? What is the question of other services that will help that student? And in fact, we know, for example, even in the case of the University of Toronto, guaranteed first-year housing in the case of the University of Toronto. It varies across our institution, but in no case is there this has been a problem.
Dr. Gatfield, I'm asking specifically about campus housing, whether it's international students or domestic. That's not my question. It's just total housing, dorm space at these research universities. Do you have a number?
We know that it is adequate for the demand.
Okay. And can you provide the number with the committee?
We don't collect that information at our association.
So how do you know that it's meeting the demand?
Because we just had a meeting of our executive heads, and it's clear that they reported that it is.
So verbally they reported to you, and you're reporting it here. How much do U15s then spend? How much do U15s spend on housing as a percentage of your total budgets?
We don't collect that information, but it's readily available. That's all public information.
So how would you know that it's sufficient?
We could help your staff provide that in terms of their ability to recruit.
But provide it to the committee, please, so that we can better understand. Then I was going to go back to the question of reputational harm. When the government announced its early changes, were you consulted?
No.
On the grad cap that was introduced in September, were you consulted?
No. Well, we fed in early on to say that that was absolutely, for us, unjustified.
Okay, thank you for that. My next questions are for Professor Scudderud, Chair. So I specifically, Professor, I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you were able to listen to some of the testimony provided by the Immigration Refugee Board, but I'll give you a few quotes from the minister just to give you time to think here. The immigration minister said that the system is out of control, and then he was quoted as saying in an article September 22nd, 2024, that there was an, quote, alarming trend of more international students claiming asylum. And you had written about in the past that international students were being made to pay exorbitant tuition premiums in Canadian college programs. And you reflected on whether there was value that they were obtaining an education versus the value of getting a spot to compete for permanent residency in Canada. You then noted that 130,000 former international students would now be on temporary visas with no realistic prospect of permanent residency. Seeing the numbers at the Immigration Refugee Board, the total volume of backlog is over 250,000 as of the end of October. It was 218,000 at the end of July, which is a 32,000 backlog increase in the last 2 months. Do you have any concerns? Can you maybe expand on what you were saying originally about these 130,000 international students who have no prospects of getting permanent residency in Canada?
Professor Scruder.
Yeah, so I have a lot to say about that. Before I do that, though, I just want to make sure, is it okay for me to leave at 1 o'clock? My understanding was this meeting would be over at 1. I got to go teach a class. Am I going to get in trouble if I take off?
No problem. You can take off.
Okay, good. So the question, all along, this concern about the exploding population, the NPR population, my worry has not been first order about housing or youth unemployment. It has been that it's been very clear in the data. I'm on a TVO interview, I think from 2 years ago, drawing attention to this. What we had was a bulging population of non-permanent residents who are seeking a pathway to permanent residency. It was growing much faster than the permanent residency population could, or the new permanent residence caps could possibly absorb them. So the writing has been on the wall for very long that this is not sustainable, that what is going inevitably to happen is that people have come here under a reasonable expectation that they are going to be able to make a transition to PR status, and they're not going to be able to do that now. And what's going to happen is their visas are going to expire, and unfortunately, there's a huge data problem behind this, and that is that Statistics Canada, the way that we count the population is we assume when the visa expires, they've left. So the data might show that the population is stabilizing, but we don't even know if they, because we don't track exits in this country in the data.
So Professor Scudder, I was going to follow up on that. So seeing the increasing number of persons applying for asylum, you noted that 130,000 international students that have no realistic path to PR. What do you think will happen then in the future? And do you have, you've been, warning the ministry for at least 2 years publicly, and that TVO interview, which I also saw, warning publicly that the decisions made by the previous immigration ministers were going to lead to a moment like this, with this large bulge in population of non-permanent residents, having no choices, being unjustly put in a very difficult position. So can you just expand on what you think will happen in the coming months?
Professor, brief answer, time is up. Go ahead, if brief answer is fine.
Oh, sorry. So, I'm not into predicting these things. For me, I look at the data and I just respond. I interpret the data. That's what I do. Trying to forecast the future, I don't know. But I'll tell you, I don't think it's true that 130,000 NPRs are going to stay. I think that's hyperbolic. I definitely don't think that's accurate. We don't know what the number is. And IRCC doesn't know what the number is. Nobody knows what the number is, because the reality is, of course, we don't know the intentions of migrants. We have no idea. They're making incredibly difficult decisions under a world in which there's incredible uncertainty. The whole system has no transparency or predictability anymore. As I said, the skilled system that was transparent has been dismantled.
Thank you very much, Professor. I know you can go at 1, so it's over 7 minutes. So I'm going to go to Mr. Chang. Mr. Chang, go ahead for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could I ask one question of Professor McKell before he leaves? So, Professor, based on your work, do you believe that establishing enrollment caps alongside other measures IRCC has taken might enhance Canada's reputation as a high-quality study destination, focusing on a sustainable number of students who can more effectively integrate into the job market post-graduation?
I have never been a fan of the caps. The minister is well aware, I think, that I am not a fan of the caps. I've made that clear to him. Caps economists don't like caps because as soon as you cap anything, you need the government to allocate. And governments are not good at picking winners. And so the much better system is to create a very transparent system that's predictable, that's not politicized. And that is what category-based selection has done. It's politicized immigrant selection, economic immigrant selection. I've been a strong critic of that. I think that's the worst immigration policy that has been introduced in this country in the last 5 decades. And I'm feel very seriously about that. So there's no need for caps if you create a transparent system, which we've had for decades. There was no need for caps. The problem is now people are playing a lottery. And school post-secondary institutions and employers that hire temporary foreign workers are monetizing that lottery. They're willing to hold it up as a carrot. Come to Canada and here's your lottery ticket. That's the problem. We need a way more transparent system than we currently have.
Thank you for that your answer, Professor. My next question is directed to Ms. Albion. Ms. Albion?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Albion, to be clear, this was not a unilateral stoppage. We consulted with provinces and territories, and Ministers Miller had asked provinces to get their houses in order, but they did not, and that's why the federal government has to take this action on limiting international students. But my question to you, I will quote a report from you here. Within Canada, public colleges in Ontario receive the lowest level of funding from their provincial government and have relied most heavily on international students as a revenue source. And can you speak to the consequences of such a move by the provincial government on international students, specifically on their well-being and success in Ontario and in those institutions from a reputational perspective?
Yes. Well, thank you for referring to that report that I wrote. I do think it's really problematic when you look at the funding. I can speak directly to Ontario, but it's similar to different extents in other provinces. But it is very concerning when the provincial government reduced the funding to colleges and universities and simultaneously put a freeze on the ability of those institutions to raise their domestic tuitions. That put those institutions in a very serious position. Colleges in Ontario are very entrepreneurial. They realized that they would have to do something to replace the reduction in funding, and they turned to international students in a very, very big way, in an unfortunately big way that caused real difficulties for the students that came to Ontario, particularly in the public-private partnerships that have been talked about this morning, where international students who arrived were getting a subpar education and a subpar student experience. And it was purely being done for financial benefit. I am actually quite pleased that the federal government used the postgraduate work permit and withdrew that opportunity for students who graduate from those, or will not to the current ones, but those people who will be entering into those partnerships in future. Into those schools in future. That in itself has reduced and dramatically the number of students who are choosing to enter those colleges that were providing subpar education and will have the biggest impact, I think, on, students have followed this and they know that they're not going to be able to stay to work post-graduation, and they are voting with their feet. They are not going to those colleges. I think that is actually a positive thing that the federal government did that has had a positive impact.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Gaffield. As the CEO of U15, how do you think the recent federal measures could encourage a more responsible approach to international student recruitment by universities and provinces, helping to ensure that the benefits of international students are fully realized without compromising the quality of our system?
This is the key question and why we are proposing the Responsible Institutions Framework, because institutions that have the capacity to provide for students, to have a full approach in terms of admission, retention, and support for international students, obviously should be promoted by Canada as at the heart of our research and innovation ecosystem, the type of talent that Canada needs to thrive in the 21st century, and it has been historically one of the great successes of making a strong Canada.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Now we will go to Mr. Bruno de Sapp, and then I'll go to MP Kwan, and that will end the meeting. So, Mr. Bruno de Sapp, please go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses appearing for this very important study. I would just like to remind us the topic of the motion that summons us here today. We want to know the current and future impacts of the recent measures from Minister Miller. And that is what really concerns me. And Mr. Garfield, maybe you can inform the committee of the future impacts, especially in terms of the research programs from your institution. Thank you very much. In fact, the measures that really affect Canada's situation, if Canada truly wants to have a future as a real future, we need an ecosystem for research that is based on talent, that is based on people who are highly skilled and who can truly take the economy and other segments of the society where we want to go. And what we see in our major institutions is that they are playing a role in driving the entire ecosystem. We work with universities, smaller universities, as well as a certain number of colleges. But together, this creates a whole research and innovation infrastructure. But talent needs to be at the core of all of this. And obviously, to have Canada as a country that attracts the best and the brightest across the world and provides Canadians and Quebecers with the ability and the capacity to sustain this research and innovation ecosystem is really key for Canada. Well, I heard you respond earlier to a question from my colleague, Mr. Kimmich. You were not consulted before implementing this measure, and I talked to people from the Réseau d'Université du Québec and the Federation of CEGEPs, etc. They were not consulted. So the stakeholders on the field, from what I get, is that before putting in place these measures, the minister and his colleagues at the department did not consult the stakeholders on the ground and the institutions that are hardest hit by these measures. And the question which I put to a previous panel, which was here from the department, do you think that these measures are more of improvisation with shadow, so-called consultations with people? Do you think that pan-Canadian measures with the different realities in the school systems across Canada, don't you think that we should rather adapt ourselves to these rather than applying the same measures across board? Thank you for your question. There are two aspects which are really key here. The first one, obviously, Canada is really country with rich diversity. We have traditions and we have and this makes our strength across Canada, and it's important to grasp the different realities nationwide in order to feed that into federal policies. And as a good example to this, we created, in order to manage the portfolio for the safety of research, we created a working group comprised of representatives like myself. I was co-chair of this working group with our government partners, and we worked together in order to develop policy and see how we can put these measures in place in order to truly reflect the strengths and the different realities across Canada, and this is working. And I think today we can say that we have the policies we need, and we've developed the required approaches in order to handle this portfolio for Canada's good. I believe that in this context, it is essential for us to have that form of collaboration. For instance, having a working group or some mechanism that allows us to be able to better understand the different complexities of this particular issue and to arrive at salient results. In fact, maybe, and you tell me if I'm mistaken here, maybe having a consultation table where different provincial and territorial and federal authorities will sit at this table with different representatives of universities and colleges. This would be important to do before announcing such measures. Yes, of course, and a key component here would be people working on the ground in universities, people managing university institutions, and who have the knowledge base that is required in order to feed into these discussions at federal level. This is why U15 Canada was set up in order to work on programs and federal initiatives in order to feed into the research and help streamline and facilitate these programs and policies. And I believe that we have what it takes in order to develop sound policies and avoid what we're currently witnessing. Oh, 30 seconds. Thank God. I mean, maybe, Ms. Alboim, I do not ask you any questions. Maybe you can tell us what are the future impacts, the most significant ones that we would witness as a result of these measures that were recently announced by Minister Miller.
I'm going to answer in English, if you don't mind. I did talk about some of the impacts in terms of reputation, in terms of public attitudes, in terms of the immediate financial impact on our institutions of reduced numbers of students and impact on local communities and employers, both in terms of labor markets and in terms of spending power in local communities. I think I agree with the other witness who talked about having one sort of blunt instrument for colleges, undergraduate programs, graduate programs doesn't really work. They serve very different purposes, and there should be different approaches to those various levels of education. And I think dealing with them all will have a negative impact on all, because one size does not fit all in this particular circumstance.
Thank you very much. It's over 7 minutes. So I'll go to MP Kwan. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for their excellent presentation. What we're seeing, of course, is that the federal government responding to the housing crisis that, frankly, successive Liberal Conservative governments created, and then the first go-to is to blame outsiders. And who are they blaming? International students. They blame migrant workers, they're blaming immigrants, and on down the line. So now, with this kind of approach, there are unintended consequences, as both of you have mentioned, and they can be very significant. So to that end, it was also mentioned that the approach the government has taken is a blunt instrument to address this situation. Now, there's a distinction between the public-private partnership that has taken place and the escalation of the problems that sort of came out. Instead of taking a specific approach to address that, the government took this other broader approach with much broader implications. So first, my question to Ms. Albion is this. By way of unintended consequences, I wonder if you can speak to about the students that are already here who will be impacted by this announcement and who will likely become out of status. And then what do you think is the appropriate approach to addressing that issue? And is regularization for these students who's invested their time and money here in Canada should be recognized?
Thank you for that question. Students who are already here in Canada, many of them will go home, many of them will go to third countries, but many of them do want to stay. And the reductions in the permanent numbers, which also they were announced in levels, will have a very significant impact on students already here. The provincial nominee programs have been reduced by 50%. Many of the provinces across the country had special streams that would allow international students to transition to permanent residency through PNPs. Other economic programs have also been reduced. So even if students qualify and are, certainly qualify with high levels of points, there won't be enough spaces for them to transition to permanent residency because those numbers have been reduced quite significantly. That's a problem. Even in terms of the international students themselves who are here now, who aren't necessarily looking for permanent residency yet, or have made up their mind or want to get some work experience before they go back to their home countries. The eligibility criteria for postgraduate work permits is in fact being restricted. So many of them will not be able to continue to work. They cannot get their PGWPs extended or renewed. And the tightening on the TFW permits is also being restricted. So I do think that there is a possibility that many current international students will have no legal avenues to remain in Canada, and that will create a difficulty.
Well, thank you very much. And then to that end, the question is, should the government actually entertain a regularization scheme for people that are already here, who's already contributed? So I'm going to park that question for you to think about, Ms. Albion. In the meantime, I'm going to go to Mr. Garfield. Thank you so much for your testimony. The one thing around housing is this. You indicated that universities has built-in systems to address the housing needs of international students. Now, back in the day, I came from the provincial arena. There was a program where the province, the federal government, and the universities or colleges, institutions would actually create housing in a partnership to address housing needs, not just for international students, but for domestic students as well. Would you support the call for the federal government to bring back a program that divides, let's say, the funding in a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 kind of split, 1/3 institution, 1/3 province, 1/3 federal government, to create a plan in developing housing to meet the needs of students, international students, as well as domestic students?
Thank you very much for that question. 3 quick points. First of all, we totally support and recognize that students need housing. They need food security as an issue and so on. We must provide for our students. That is one of the reasons, I think, why our institutions have, in fact, embarked on policies of real modest growth. Never démesuré, too rapid growth. To ensure that they're able to keep pace. And third, along the lines of what you're saying, there have been really ingenious and effective ways to try to do this. I know, for example, some of our universities have bought hotels in partnership sometime and so on to provide extra space. And I'm not aware of the program that you speak, but I do think that we need, universities have been good in being open to that sort of program.
All right, thank you. I have very little time left. And so what I'm gathering is that we support a federal provincial institution housing initiative to address student needs. That's what I'm hearing. Back to Ms. Albiam on the question about regularization. Maybe just a quick short answer. Should regularization be considered as part of the approach to addressing the crisis that the federal government has created?
I have written about the need for a regularization program in Canada, and I think that it would be in the best interest of Canada to implement a regularization program for the many people who have been here and fallen out of status as a result of all kinds of things, including changes to programs in midstream after they have arrived. I would not suggest a regularization program purely for students. I would recognize a regularization program in which students would be eligible, and if they met the criteria of the regularization program, they would be eligible as well.
Very much, almost 7 minutes now, MP Kwan.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, before you adjourn, though, could I just make this as a broad request to the witnesses? Because we're always limited for time, and if they have additional documentations that they wish to share or recommendations to which they wish to share with the committee, for them to submit it. And particularly, I'm interested in unintended consequences and what those implications are, and of course, what action the government should take to address them.
Thank you to the witnesses on behalf of the committee. I appreciate that. And thank you to the sports staff, analysts, clerk, and the interpreters. With that, meeting is adjourned.